Hello, folks. My name's Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters here at WJOPLP, Joppa Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts. And like every episode, right, I'm always excited to get into the funk, and the funk is really good this week. We started thinking about February as Black History Month. Last episode, we delved into the aesthetics of Black history. This week, well, y'all are in for a treat. We have an amazing, a burgeoning celebrity superstar, awesome scholar in Bailey Thomas, who's going to join us for a conversation and everything here. Dr. Bailey Thomas, they are the Eleanor M. Carlson Visiting Assistant Professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Rhode Island. Previously, they were an assistant professor of philosophy and held a postdoc fellow in the Department of Philosophy at Dartmouth College. Their research focuses on bridging the gaps between epistemic, ethical, and political sphere through an argument of the integration of ethical and political frameworks into the social epistemology. During their time at the University of Rhode Island, they will be assisting with the organization of the Mellon event series. One of the things that they do, of course, is they'll be hosting a manuscript on the concept of care as a central concept of Black American feminist political theory. Other projects include an analysis thinking about erasure and appropriation of feminist thought, of Black feminist thought that goes along with this aspect too. You know, Dr. Thomas' work develops a radical Black feminist approach to understanding, the epistemological, the political, the ethical aspect of structural oppression and the lived experience of marginalized folks that's there. They received their PhD in philosophy and African American studies, thinking about the diaspora studies from Penn State University. They also attended Loyola University in Chicago, where they earned a BA with honors in the Department of Philosophy. My friend, Dr. Thomas, welcome to Race Matters.
Thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction.
I'm excited. Your CV, your materials are really impressive, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted you here on Race Matters to really kind of help us understand your work, help us understand really particularly the plight when we think about academic studies, we think about the realities of Black people, of Black queer folks, of Black women, about really the nature of your work and where the field is going and how that really aligns, right? For everyday folks who may not be a part of the academy, and yet your work has a direct impact on them. But here's what I want to do. I want folks to get to know you a little bit better before we delve into some of the other heavier aspects of this. So, tell us a little bit about your academic background, dating back to high school. And as
Oh,
you think
yeah,
about your work, right? Is this where you thought you would be at this juncture in your young life, but is this where you thought you would be here in 2025?
absolutely not. No, no. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so in high school, I was still on the pre-med journey. So like a lot of children of single Black mothers, I wanted to be into medicine. My mom is also a nurse, so there's definitely that medical connection there. And on her side of the family, we do have a lot of nurses and some doctors. But at high school, I thought I was going to be a traumatic brain injury neurosurgeon. And don't laugh,
No, not like
but we just spoke
love it.
about how, remember, I grew up in Baltimore. So you remember who's a big Black neurosurgeon from Baltimore.
We are not going to mention his
We
name
aren't, but
because
but yeah,
we've traded him away.
exactly. but I have a signed book by that man. He was my hero.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so,
it's interesting because, and again, we're not going to mention his name. If folks don't know who we're talking about, just Google it and figure it out. But I read his book when I was really young.
mhm.
What was that book called?
Gifted hands.
Gifted Hand.
They just have a, I think they made a documentary
They,
or some
it
Lifetime
was
movie
a
about him or
movie,
whatever.
and
Yeah.
I loved it. And then, of course, we get older and find out that a lot of it's fabricated.
Yeah.
But well, yeah, I'll pause there. So keep going on telling us about this path and wanting to be going to be MD and the healthcare field, and yet here you are,
Here I am. Yeah, I'm a doctor, just a different kind of
different
doctor.
kind.
So, like many people, what happened was I got into undergrad, and so I wanted to be unique because I was aware that, and for folks listening in, I graduated high school in 2013. So this is fall 2013. I'm starting college at Loyola, and I was intentional about getting out of Philadelphia. I didn't want to go to Penn State for undergrad, didn't want to go to Temple, Drexel. I wanted to be far away from all the people from my high school, the small Catholic school in Philadelphia that was all girls and had nuns.
Oh, that's
Oh,
interesting.
yeah. So once I got to Loyola, during the time frame between me applying for colleges and then actually arriving and having my first college classes, my mom randomly drops, a bombshell on me that my maternal grandmother not only had a PhD, but she had a PhD in philosophy and was one of the first Black women in the country to get her PhD in philosophy.
I see a future book coming here, but okay.
Oh, it's in the works. It's in the
Okay, I
works.
figured that.
Yeah. So, mind you, my grandmother died in 2002, I think. And she died of heart failure. She was 54. I was in second
Wow.
grade. So I was seven or eight. And the time that I knew her, she worked at Target. She worked at Target part-time. I didn't know that she even had a college education, much less a PhD. So learning that, and then of course she just, randomly grabs my grandmother's dissertation, which was written on a word processor, just a fancy little typewriter. She hated computers. And even though she defended in December of 91, but it took her 15 years from the master's all the way up through the PhD. And she was the first Black woman to get her PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University, which was a huge deal. And I
Yeah.
think speaking to one of her committee members, a couple of them are still living, she was one of the first Black students, period, to get their PhDs from Vanderbilt at that time. So, having, of course, not known any of this, I didn't even know what philosophy was at that point. I tried to read the dissertation. This was when I was 17 or so, and I didn't understand any of it. So I put it away, went to college, had my first philosophy class. Loyola is a Jesuit school, so
Yes, it
philosophy
is.
classes are mandatory. And by the end of my first week, I had changed my major from psychology pre-med to philosophy pre-med.
Is this because did you change it because of this inclination of of the work of your grandmother, or
I mean, I think that might have been in the back of my mind,
yeah,
but I was at that point in my life where I was really starting to miss her more because she died when I was so young. My memories of her are, fleeting. And so I wanted to learn more about what she did for a living. She adjuncted at several universities in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, Notre Dame, Maryland, Loyola, Maryland. She worked predominantly at Morgan State University, though. So once I changed my major to philosophy, I kept it because I thought, it'll make me look unique on the applications.
yes.
But then Orgo happened. And yeah, so drop pre-med because I could not pass Orgo. And I had a crisis because at that point it was the
You,
end of my sophomore year and I
Liz,
had no major.
you should tell folks what our goal is.
Oh, organic chemistry. So you can't even
That
say the name. It's so
Yeah,
traumatic.
it is, and it is it's one of those things that really it challenges folks to think about, is this really what you want to do?
And it's such a scam because I'm sorry, it's just one of those classes where, and I'm going to say this as a college professor, there are certain classes where I feel like they just make a lot of money for the university. That's why they offer so many bio and chem sections, and intro classes, because they know so many students are pre-med. They have you take these prerequisites. I'm not saying they weren't useful in the past, but now everything is so specialized. I mean, it's very unlikely that I would need that class. In addition to the fact that you have to relearn everything when you go to med school anyway.
Well, and the thing's interesting about a course like organic chemistry, which I never obviously took. I took an
Good
inorganic
for you.
and everything too, is the fact that it seems like something mainly for chemists or academics. It's almost like, do you really need calculus to be a medical MD? No.
And and that's the thing too. The classes are notoriously difficult. I mean, the curves are, I think in my class, a 60 was in the A range.
I would have
That's
lost.
wild.
That is unbelievable. But
It is.
but you got to give them credit though, right? You're taking courses that are challenging you to be analytical, that the rigorous aspects that are there. Oh, the traditions of those Jesuits, I tell you what, which sounds very consistent. So, you know, you're doing this work and everything too, and you major in philosophy as well as African American studies along the way. That's there. So how tell us about your work now, in a sense that you've made your way into the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. How does that connect to your philosophy background, which I have some ideas, and your work dealing with African American studies?
So my position as the Carlson visiting assistant professor is primarily to provide classes on Black feminist theory and to also conduct research on Black feminist theory and womanist theory. So the department has the Mellon grant that was actually extended. It was going to end this summer, this spring 2025. We got it extended for another year to the end of spring 26. And the position is for 2 years. So while I'm here, I'm teaching those classes on Black feminist theory. I'm also teaching most of the classes on feminist theory and methodology, because a lot of my background and training is in critical theory. And a lot of foundational terms and concepts in gender and women's studies actually come from philosophers or other critical theory folks. So it wasn't that bad of a sort of disciplinary gap to fill. But my intention of, pursuing a dual title in graduate school was really to always have an interdisciplinary background that would allow me to be in different departments. I never wanted to just be in a philosophy department. And I never actually took any African American studies classes until I got to grad school.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that experience was phenomenal. And, I can say this now because I have my degree and they can't take it back. It's right there. I have to say most of my, most memorable classes in grad school were my AFAM courses.
Mhm.
And I think it's because AFAM, or whether it's AFAM, Black Studies, whatever the department is called, it's interdisciplinary by nature. And philosophers they're always so siloed and they've really struggled to be interdisciplinary. And then there's always that question of, well, is this actually philosophy or not?
Right.
Which I hated hearing because I'm a dual title student. So yeah, it is philosophy because I said so. I even remember having to argue with someone about Du Bois being a philosopher, and that was wild. I mean, he went to Germany. He
Right. To
studied
do that,
Hegel.
yes.
Yeah. I mean, so it's something that it's not surprising for me that I see myself in this position now. Certainly from high school, big jump. But
Right.
from grad school to here, It
much of
makes
a
sense.
yeah, a smaller jump and everything. And so we think about your work and everything, and we are wrestling under this paradigm, these paradigm shifts that are happening. Particularly, we think about the political construction that's underway right now. One of the things that I noted is that institutions like the University of Iowa, and I was surprised by this because you think about, we think about Iowa, we think about red state, we think about, I mean, Iowa, it's Iowa, but yet, and Iowa has, one of the best history departments, one of the best, gender studies departments, writing is huge there. And yet, the state legislature in the state of Iowa, because of the assault on DEI, they have essentially taken women and gender studies, Jewish studies, and all this, and just kind of thrown them together. And you essentially have seen the vanishing of these disciplines that are there. What are your thoughts on that? And do you have any concerns, or are you hopeful that academics and folks will continue to campaign against these egregious decisions that are happening?
And I got a lot of thoughts. Some of them I can't say
That's
on
fair.
the
That's
podcast,
fine.
but I
That's
will say it's not surprising to me entirely. And I also want to remind folks that the vanishing of classes that are labeled DEI is not new. And I think we give the current administration too much credit because these classes have been at risk for years.
Mhm.
And, as someone who's also in a subfield of ethnic studies, we have to also be mindful of the fact that, for example, in Arizona, I mean, Chicano studies was illegal
That's
for
right.
the longest time. So, as has been said by many Black studies scholars, our history has always been contraband. And I think what's unique about the current situation is just one, I think the magnitude in terms of coverage that these incidences are getting, and also the fact that now it's also white people who have their jobs at risk as well. And a lot of
Absolutely.
white women professors
Yes.
are also seeing the effects of this. I mean, they're not just going after ethnic studies. I've seen American studies classes at the University of Iowa also
So
be
I
shafted.
didn't know about American Studies there.
It's a whole
Yeah.
bunch of classes across the curriculum.
I mean, and I appreciate the fact that you brought up that this assault on these courses, has been going on for a period of time, so it's nothing new, right? And again, the magnitude, a lot of people who like to shout and talk loud, right, kind of, exacerbating what's happening and everything too. But yet, we think about this and we think about, the work that we do, the work that you do, and the fact that people are essentially telling us that we're going to engage in a practice of erasure, that your identity is nothing but a memory and is not relevant to the rest of the world. And that's what I wrestle with quite a bit. The fact that someone's telling me my past, my history, doesn't merit much whatsoever. But then I start to ask the question, things such as Black History Month is under assault, as we know, right? But yet, will that same practice be practiced when we get to March and we have to think about Irish history and drinking the green beer and the conceptions of race? And I'm just going on and on, but I want to step back and I want to get your thoughts on hearing this stuff.
I mean, what immediately came to mind as you were talking were the various videos. Again, my mom, the TikToker, sending me videos of all the Black folks boycotting Target.
Yes.
And they lost, I mean, mad money. I don't remember. She told me the number. I want to say it was in the high millions of dollars. Um, so I mean, of course, there's the economic aspect of it, and I think Al Sharpton was also calling for a boycott as well. I think he also led some folks to Costco to get memberships. And so, the canceling of Black History Month is interesting because in some ways it hasn't been canceled, right? It's just
Right.
different companies profiting that maybe didn't, outwardly advertise themselves as being inclusive before. Um, and what was also interesting too was that Trump also put out some declaration for Black History Month as well,
I
even
saw
though we
that.
had canceled it. Yeah, so that was, that all of that weirdness aside, I think that what we're seeing really is, especially in terms of the connection between the educational and political spheres, we're really being tested with our praxis here. So are we going to bend to the will of these administrations in advance and cancel classes and close departments? I mean, University of Iowa is just only one of many universities that have reacted in advance of all of these directives. And I'm also conscious that, I'm at a public state institution that relies severely on federal funding. And so once it was clear that he won the election, I immediately started thinking of, what I would do if, you know, the provost comes in and says, all right, you got to pack it up. Because when I think about my teaching, especially the classes that I've taught and the assignments and the readings and content that I provide to my students and have them engage with, it's always been political. It's
Mhm.
always been provocative. And in fact, I'm reminded of when I was in grad school, right before I was assigned to teach my first class solo. I had to meet with my teaching advisor, who happened to be the director of graduate studies for my program in philosophy. And he sat me down. He wanted to have a meeting. And when white folks ask for that nebulous meeting, right? So I get into the room and, he makes awkward small talk. And then he says, about your syllabus, you don't have any canonical philosophy on here, and your syllabus looks like you have an agenda. And I
And
said, well, Western philosophy is an agenda.
yes.
So there's that awkward stare. And I don't remember what he said afterwards. He said some things and I just agreed to it. And I remember him saying, I'm surprised you're being so agreeable to this. When in reality, all I did was I changed like the first 3 weeks and added some dead white men to it. And I just kept it pushing. I didn't change anything else.
But I mean, but he was telling you though that there's this perception that there's a canon of what people should know and learn, and this is what defines philosophy that's
Mm-hmm.
there. Going
Mm-hmm.
back to your earlier point where folks then subscribe W.E.B. Du Bois as a philosopher,
Right.
right? Which is part of the work that's there too. You know,
Right.
and I'm glad you mentioned that, thinking about your teaching and everything too. Um, what does your day-to-day work look like as an academic on a university campus, thinking about your research, your administrative work, your teaching, all those other functionalities that are there?
I mean, as one of the many professors with ADHD, it's not as organized as it should be. But I teach typically 2 days a week. So I've settled into Tuesdays and Thursdays. I've got two classes. I have one class online this semester as well. So I've got a three-class load, which is interesting. But typically I try to arrange my time on campus around when I'm most productive. So my office hours, which, students may or may not come to. My
I
dog
know
also
that
comes
all,
on campus,
I know
so
that all too well.
they'll
Yes.
come to see him. They won't talk to me, but they'll talk to Baldwin. Um, and so I try to organize, those 3 hours around doing some research, some reading, editing. Sometimes I'm just relaxing because there's just so much that goes into being a professor that I was just not prepared for. I felt like I graduated, I started my first job at the University of Louisville, and I was getting all these emails. People wanted me on committees. And why am I doing all this extra labor? Because you all don't have other, diverse people and everything's falling on me. But of course, I'm not getting paid extra for it. I'm not getting compensated. or recognized for it. So that's one of the things that's been, the most difficult. There's a lot of invisible labor being not just a scholar of color, being a queer scholar, disabled scholar. So it's more than just the act of physically going into the classroom and teaching 2 75-minute classes twice a week. It's also, how do I support my students that are coming to me with all of these concerns and issues, and how am I responding to situations on campus or dealing with, potentially other colleagues who are also being problematic, and navigating all of those different things is one of the peculiar aspects of academia, because in a lot of ways you kind of have to pretend that you're all in on the joke, if you get what I mean,
I,
even though you are absolutely aware that a lot of this it's just a mirage.
one of the things you mentioned, of course, is you talked about that invisible labor and having to wear multiple hats and how to support folks and everything too. Now, when it comes to queer Black folks, what concerns you about your field, and where this country is at regarding being inclusive?
Things that concerns me the most, honestly, is really the lack of understanding about queerness that I've encountered in conversations with other Black people, whether they're scholars or otherwise. And I think for a lot of people, I don't know if it's because of how the media portrays, queerness, transness, etc. But there's always this immediate assumption that anything LGBTQ or the legitimate equality community, as I've also heard it said, is, inherently tied to whiteness. And my main issue has been getting people to recognize that, being queer is not a white thing. There have been Black and queer trans people for centuries,
Have
even on
you
the continent.
absolutely have you found a kind of a distance among Black folks in grasping with this? Because we do know within a Black community, for a long period of time, this has been a problematic topic, to say the least. And what has been your experiences, whether with students, colleagues, family folk, or anyone else, and really trying to understand the plethora of what it means to be queer, Black and queer, I'm sorry.
So my grandmother was a lesbian, and I didn't learn that until later in life.
I can't wait till you learn.
Um, I'm telling you, this book is just wild because so much of my experience mirrors hers, and I didn't learn about it until later. So she actually, when she passed away, she was with a longtime partner who was a Black um, trans mask man, I would say. But I always knew him as a man. I didn't know what trans was back then. And I remember one day my mother, again, randomly just dropping, loads of information on me. Oh yeah, your grandmother was a lesbian. We were riding bikes, and I still concretely remember her just, riding off after she said that, and I'm just standing there, mouth agape.
Well, you're like, wait. You're just going to drop this and keep riding?
Right.
We need to unpack this a little bit, and why now?
Exactly. So my grandmother grew up in a Christian family. Her brother, my great uncle, is a pastor. And coincidentally, my father's side also has a lot of religious folks, pastors, deaconesses, prophetesses, and etc. And my grandmother found it hard to come out because of the religious community that she was in. But she initially wanted to actually go to graduate school to study divinity. She wanted to be a pastor in the AME church. And whoever was the pastor at the time, this Black man basically told her, I mean, one, you're gay, and two, you're a woman. So why don't you do secretary work? And that's what led her to philosophy. And most of the Black queer folks that she had solidarity with, they weren't other faculty members, they were actually her students. And that's been my experience as well. It's been, it took my mom and I a long time to come to an understanding about queerness and what that meant. And I think for some people, it might have been maybe they remember certain, traumatic events that they've seen or witnessed, experienced because of, the discrimination that those Black people faced. For other people, though, I think, again, it's just this idea that somehow white people get all this credit with coming up with things. So they invented queerness, they invented transness. And so if you are then a part of, the alphabet community, then you're just trying to be white. And besides it just being insulting and ahistorical, I mean, it's just also not realistic and it's not true. But with the invisible labor aspect, again, when we look at so many social justice movements, especially within the Black community, Black Lives Matter, a big one,
Led
three
by
queer
queer
Black
women.
women.
Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely.
We're always there,
I mean,
always.
and I'm glad you pointed that out and really thinking about these things that we have to wrestle with. It's one of those things where, folks make assumptions, right? And it's interesting too, where, you know, and I'm going to say this and I shouldn't say this. I'm going to say, well, you may be too young to remember this, but I remember, and that's, it's a horrible thing for me to say. Um, but I remember back in the early 2000s, for example, one of the big controversies was over a show that came out called The L Word. And The L Word was produced by,
Vaguely remember
you remember, look it up when you get a chance. It was
that.
produced by Showtime. I saw some of it, but the problem, of course, were a couple. One, particularly among um, queer black folks and gender non-binary folks, they looked at this and they interpreted the show as this is a bourgeois whiteness, this projection of this is the ideal functionality of what gay folks, what queer folks, this is what they look like, and they have this ideal sense of this body type, this sense of whiteness, this sense of wealth that's there. And again, there were some things that were done really well, but you watch the show, and I'll never forget reading this. And this was a while ago. Someone said as they watched it, there are just a lot of beautiful people on this show. And it's so misleading. And then I remember someone else saying, this show is nothing but about eroticism for straight men to watch. It has nothing to do with the realities of the paradigm of queerness. You got to check out the L Word.
I am, and honestly, as you were talking, I mean, I was just thinking of conversations I've had with friends about that, especially when we're talking about dating apps. There are so many, you know, exact stories of this happening on Hinge, Grinder, other, queer and gay dating apps, and especially what you were saying about body type. There's
Yeah.
so much fat phobia in the queer
Yes.
community, especially when it comes to fat queer people of color. It's way too much.
I have a friend of mine. I won't mention his name. Awesome human being. A black guy. He's married to a white European man, and I'll never forget one of the things he told me was that he talked about the racism among gay men, but he talked about how, and again, these are things that I didn't know, and I've been in those spaces, but I'm a cis straight man, so the things that I don't know. But then he talked about how for him being married to a white man, it gave him social capital.
Oh yeah.
I was blown up.
Oh
I didn't
yeah.
know.
Yeah. The queer community, like, and I'm gonna say the mainstream queer
Right.
community, is extremely white and also extremely cis too. And, it very much mirrors, the criticisms of the mainstream feminist movement, especially first and second wave feminism, if you
Yeah.
subscribe to waves, which I don't, but There
You
they
know, I'm
exist.
guilty to subscribing to ways, so maybe I
I
need to
think it's
tweak
a
that.
it's a good
Easy to
way.
categorize.
Exactly. That's how I tell my students, but like don't actually think that these are, rigid structures because then you end up kind of being led to believe that women of color feminism didn't happen until the late 80s and 90s, and that wasn't true. Black women, especially indigenous and Native American women, they were some of the first feminists before white women even thought about being a feminist. And a lot of that is because of the racial dynamics that were at play. White women have that social capital and protection from white men. And as Marilyn Frye said famously, white women will collude with white men on matters when it pertains to race, even if it's at the detriment of, gender progress.
Well, I mean,
We've seen
we
this with women voting for Trump. I mean,
no.
continuously.
Well, I mean, we could take that back. Let's go back to. I mean, let's go back to the late 1840s, 50s. We get into that way. We go back to the work of even with Douglas and wrestling with race and
Mm-hmm.
gender, and we get into Stowe and all of these folks and white women who were abolitionists, but yet
Uh-huh.
they would they after we gained a franchise, sold black people out, black men out, and black women, black folks out in general for their own social progress. That's
Miss Susan, I'd rather die than see a black man vote Anthony.
yes, but no one talks about that.
I do.
Well, of course, I know you.
That's the first thing I tell students. I told my intro class this, I think the second day of class, and they were just staring at me like I mean, you have to tell them. You have to. There was a children's book I saw that really pissed me off one day. I was at a black-owned bookstore in New Jersey, and I think it was Douglas and either Anthony or Stanton. I think it might have been Elizabeth Stanton, actually. And it was
That
talking
would make
about how
me.
they were best friends and they worked together. And I was like, sis, this is a lie.
Mhm.
She took it off the shelves. Because you can't have people
Oh, did she? She
thinking.
took it off the
She
shelf.
did.
Oh,
Yes.
good. Oh, that's
Because you
excellent.
can't, I mean, that's just unethical to me. It's one thing to have, the white people having their historical fantasies and, making themselves give a pat on the back for doing great things, but you can't lie about stuff like that because those women and men, abolitionists, they did horrendous things to black
Right,
folks.
but my friend, I'm sorry, you're getting into critical theory, and you're getting into you're unfolding things that people don't want to think about because it doesn't line up to that perfect narrative of straightening out the crisis within the American endemic problem of racism.
I always said they shouldn't have given me that degree. I swear, when I was walking across the stage, I actually looked over my shoulder because I thought someone was going to run and take it from me.
I love it. I love it. As we get toward the end here of Race Matters, I'm Eddie Carson, a host, and I'm here with Professor Bailey Thomas from the University of Rhode Island out of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. Having a fantastic conversation. I'm learning a lot and just really fascinated by your work and everything. And that brings me, to this point that I want to ask you. We think about some of your theoretical approaches to really addressing some of the critical challenges that are unfolding within this paradigm of society that's here. But you know, help me understand, help our listeners understand, and not just you, but folks within your field, how does your work better inform the average person in need of resources to address a litany of problems maybe they're facing, whether it's identity, maybe it's mental health. We can go on and on and on. How does that trickle down to the average person who is, working 9 to 5 and paying their bills, but yet your work does help advance their causes?
That's $1 million question. And I want to say, not everyone's work actually does that.
Mhm.
There's this problem of abstraction in academia, and it's often, posited towards white folks, but black scholars do it too. And many of these scholars, I'm not going to name names, of course, but they know who they are. and they're making mad money off of talks and books about, the average Joe Black person that they've never been in conversation with. They
Yeah.
would never even sit next to these people. They would never be in a community with them. They're not at events where these people are at. And look, I'm not dissing anyone who just wants to be a scholar and live the academic life. If you want to do that, that's fine. Just be
Right.
honest about
But,
it.
but right, don't pretend to be something
Exactly.
else along the way.
Exactly. And I grew up working poor. And so even though my mom's side of the family that I was, raised around, even though they all are educated, they have, masters, several masters, some doctorates. We've always been at that working class, working poor background. And so I've always had those folks in mind. And I would say instead of the work trickling down, I wanted to directly go to them. I wanted to directly not just impact, or I want to say it's not so much teaching them something. What I'm trying to do is rather synthesize what a lot of us have been saying, especially over, the decades of Black intellectual thought, and trying to, situate, or maybe a better way to say it is frame how these different ideologies are useful for addressing our current social and political relations. So I
Mhm.
don't think, a lot of it's not, I have to go to Audre Lorde. She always says, there's no thing as something new. It's only, making new ways of being felt.
Mhm.
So a lot of our work, is coming from the same long, lengthy tradition of Black radical theory. And that gives me hope in the sense that when it comes to discussions about, dismantling white supremacy, what do we do about Trump? What do we do about the Department of Education probably not being a thing in, 2 weeks? These are challenges that have been faced before, maybe not in this direct manifestation, but let's not act like we haven't had a time period where Black folks were not given access to education, where the Department of Education didn't exist, and we were all in schoolhouses together, and learning had to be done in fugitive spaces, especially when, it was illegal for Black people to be able to read and write. So what I'm trying to do, especially with this current project on care and Black feminism, I'm trying to think about what are the things that we really need to keep in mind? What are some past ideas that might be helpful from the ancestors as we navigate this current, hellscape that we're dealing with? And so with the CARE project, I'm kind of on the fence. It started off as this academic project, but now it's more of a popular press book where I'm just talking about the fact that Black feminists are some of the worst people to each other.
Wow, that's an indictment.
It is, but I mean, it's almost like it's par for the course. If you're not a Black feminist scholar, if you don't got beef with another Black feminist scholar, it's wild, but there are so many times when, and I run that annual roundtable for Black feminists and womanist theory, and
Right, I've seen that. Yes.
I can't tell you how many times we have a conversation about how hard it is to do this work because it's other Black women stabbing you in the back. It's hard.
I mean, and I think that's always the challenging thing, in and there's for Black folks, and I'll speak for myself, and I've shared this with some other people. Um, there's nothing that breaks my heart the most when I sell out to advance the cause and champion Black folks, and I do that because that's what I do. I'm one of those folks that I will not publicly, unless it's the person from Baltimore we were talking about earlier, that we will not name who that person is. I will not disparage Black folks because I think there are a lot of other folks who do that for us. But then when it gets back to me that some of those same Black folks are doing that exact thing to other Black people, I feel gutted. My heart, there's nothing worse than having your heart broken and your soul crushed, and you shake your head and you sit there and you think, were you not raised the right way? Do you not get it? And I feel like I'm hearing some of that from what you're saying here.
It's the, crabs in a barrel
It is.
analogy. And I
So
think it's sad, but it's reality.
So I always like to give my guests the last take, thought, whatever it can be, what you're hopeful for, excited about, anything as we bring this episode of Race Matters to an end. Professor Thomas, you have the microphone. Anything you would like to share with folks that's percolating, have at it. You have the last take.
When you said one of the ideas, maybe share what you're excited about. I'm excited to honestly just be selfish and focus on me and my work. As much as I want to, be obsessed with whatever the hell is coming out of DC, especially as it pertains to my job, I just can't.
Mhm.
I can't. And I think there's a slight advantage because Black academics are used to being overwhelmed, overworked, and constantly dealing with administration, maybe not at the federal level, but certainly at the university and college level. And, it wouldn't be the first time that, there have been threats against my job, even under Biden. And I would say that the the thing that I'm most looking forward to is really creating intentional and meaningful spaces with folks that, I can just break bread with. And I know that they have my back and I have theirs, and we're not having to engage in the, academic niceties of it all. We can just be real.
There is nothing like that. Folks, this is Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson. You just heard from the awesome, excellent, and brilliant Dr. Bailey Thomas from the University of Rhode Island. Hope you chime in next time. Thank you.